and welcome to this episode of China Edge brought to you by the SupChina team. I'm your host, Lizzie, an MIT-trained economist turned journalist here at Wall Street TV who covers China and its relation to the world. Here at China Edge, we go beyond the headlines and guide you, our audience, through the jungle of Chinese regulations. We go deep into industry trends and identify challenges and opportunities in the Chinese market.
Hi, this is Lizzie, host of the China Edge show. We have prepared both English and Chinese subtitles for the show. You can turn on subtitles by clicking the CC icon at the bottom of your YouTube video. Click on the gear icon and select from one of the three languages, English, Chinese Simplified, and Chinese Traditional. 大家好，这里是李琦。在 China Edge 节目中，我们为您准备了中英双语字幕，请您按照屏幕上的指示打开齿轮图标，选择需要的语言，然后选择 CC 按钮，打开字幕，这样就可以看到有字幕的节目了。
Since 2020, the Chinese authorities have launched a raft of regulatory crackdowns on the country's tech sector, including suspensions of IPOs, record fines, and data security investigations, sending share prices tumbling and investor confidence shaken. In the face of rising economic woes this year, it seems like Chinese tech sector will finally get some breathing room. It has been reported in multiple media outlets that Beijing will probably switch to acquiring 1% golden share to ensure the private sector's actions are in alignment with the state's core interests and security concerns. Joining me today to discuss this very topic is Angela Zhang, an antitrust specialist and associate professor of law at the University of Hong Kong. Thank you, Angela, for being here with me.
Thanks for having me, Lizzie.
So, Angela, can you please first help us understand how golden shares actually work? Specifically, what kind of leverage would a golden share arrangement give Chinese regulators? And how does a golden share arrangement compare with, say, direct regulatory interventions as we saw in the previous 2 years?
Right. So a golden share generally refers to a share by a state investor in a firm in return for some special management rights or voting rights. And typically, it involves veto power over important corporate decisions that could affect public interest. And this kind of investment really dates back to the 1980s when Margaret Thatcher was promoting the privatization of the British state-owned enterprises. And then it has gained popularity among a lot of European countries as when they underwent privatization reforms. And in around 2014, as you may recall, China at that time was promoting the mixed ownership reform. And for the first time, it proposed the concept called special management rights in state-owned firms. And that basically involved the sale of some stakes of state-owned firms to private investors while allowing the state to retain this kind of special management rights in those companies. So at that time, this kind of special management rights is actually quite similar to the golden share arrangement that we have seen in other jurisdictions. But then this kind of concept started to evolve since 2017 with the popularity of the Chinese online social media platform, particularly those short video apps. And the government started to consider special management rights in those privately owned social media platforms, primarily for the purpose of content control. And around that time, we have started to see state-owned media companies purchasing more or less a 1% stake in some of the online content providers. And in return, the state investor can appoint a director to the board of those companies and also indirectly influence the appointment of the editor of those companies, particularly editor-in-chief, in order to ensure the compliance of the content moderation policy from the Chinese government. Now, on a few occasions, this kind of investment also helped the online content providers to obtain news license, which is very important for these companies because they run a very big operating risk without those news license. There is obvious advantage of this kind of golden share arrangement from the government's perspective because it's kind of internalized the conflict between the firm and the government regulator who can directly influence the firm's corporate decisions. So this preemptively addressed some of the government's concern, which saved the need for potentially very costly regulatory intervention, as you have just mentioned. But it's also highly controversial, right, in the sense that there could be a lot of tensions between the government investor and other commercial investors in the firm who may not necessarily share the similar goal, right? The commercial investor will prioritize on profit-driven goals, where the government might emphasize more on public interest. So this is one of the reasons why golden share arrangement, we haven't seen it widely apply among Chinese tech firms.
Right, so that's super helpful. As you alluded to, golden shares or similar arrangement, in fact, are not new. CIF, the State Investment Fund, and its affiliate have taken board seats in Weibo, ByteDance, and have invested in companies like Kuaishou and Himalaya. Do we have any evidence on how much these investments or ownership stakes you just mentioned affect those firms' decision making? What's the effect on those firms' valuations, as far as you can tell?
Right. I mean, so the China Internet Investment Fund that you just mentioned did make an investment in Weibo back in April 2020, and a similar investment in ByteDance the following year. Now, in both cases, they were golden share arrangement because the nominal investment in the firm did enable the government investor the right to appoint a director to the board. And according to Weibo's public disclosure, this government-appointed director have veto power over content moderations. So this is kind of in line with the previous investment that we were talking about, and as well as the financing decisions of the company. It didn't mention whether this government-appointed director have veto power over other types of corporate decisions, which are normally exercised by the board of directors. Now, we don't know the exact details of the state influence over ByteDance, although I suspect it's something along the line of content control, because the firm that the government invested in is the operating company that holds the license for Toutiao and Douyin. So this is still similar to the previous goal we were talking about from the government to ensure quality control of online content. Now, regarding investor reaction, I think it's a bit early to predict at this point. Obviously, in the past, it seems like golden share investment will primarily apply. No, it's not just primarily, but all apply to online content providers. And these companies at the same time also run a very big regulatory compliance with content moderation. You might recall back in 2018, the Chinese regulatory authorities publicly denounced 19 online short video companies for illegal content, and 15 of them have their apps completely removed from the App Store, and some of them have the operation suspended. So regulation is very costly for these companies, and having a government investor on the board might help alleviate some of this concern. But now the golden share arrangement we are talking about seems to be a bit different, because some authority seems to be promoting the idea to expand this scheme, not just to online content providers, but all data-rich tech firms. So the scope is much bigger, and the government's influence over corporate decision is likely to be bigger, right? So it all comes down to a case-by-case analysis at this point, because the policy is very fluid, right? So which company is the government invested in, and what specific rights is this government investor entitled to, right? I mean, so the investors will need to weigh the costs and benefits of this golden share arrangement. Now, one thing I want to clarify is that not all state investments in Chinese tech firms are golden share investment. The China Internet Investment Fund has invested in a lot of Chinese technology companies, including Kuaishou, and as you mentioned, and Himalaya. These are the social media platforms. But when I look at their public disclosure, it doesn't seem to be golden share arrangement, because it seems like it's more commercial oriented, because it only involves economic interest and doesn't give the investor any special management rights in these firms, at least from the public disclosure.
Right, so that's very good to know. I wanted to take a step back. So there are multiple bureaucracies with a regulatory authority, and to outsiders, that can be quite confusing. So Angela, can you first sort of give us a brief intro to the key players here? Who is in charge of what, and how do those regulatory bodies' powers overlap or could potentially conflict with each other?
Well, Lizzie, this is a very big question. And obviously, China has a very vast bureaucracy. And at the central level, there are 45 ministerial level agencies, institutions, and organizations. If we go through all of them, and a similar structure is replicated at the local provincial level. And at least half of these organizations has some sort of regulatory governance of this firm. So if we go through all of them, we'll never be able to finish today's interview. But I could particularly highlight, for instance, in the antitrust and competition sector, you have, the State Administration for Market Regulation, you have the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, you have the Ministry of Commerce. These are active players in this area. And for data regulation, at the central level already involve 4 major regulators, as well as a whole patchwork of sector regulators, which you also see at the provincial level. So it's highly, highly complicated. And what you mentioned is exactly right. I mean, although each ministry have their own responsibility and functions, they do overlap with each other, particularly when it comes to internet sector, because the products and services generated from this sector are very new. And sometimes it's not entirely clear which authority have regulatory control over this sector. Like one example is the P2P finance. When this first came out, it's actually not clear who is in charge. And it wasn't until several big financial scandals that emerged that the central government decided to intervene and later completely shut down this sector. And sometimes this kind of power fragmentation you observe in the Chinese bureaucracy also, naturally also lead to regulatory competition. And as regulators vie for control. Now, this kind of power fragmentation also have strong implication for the golden share arrangement that we are talking about today. Because from my standpoint, what you see is that golden share definitely will not be a panacea for Chinese tech firms to address all these regulatory problems, right? Because of the fragmented nature of the Chinese bureaucracy, even within the same ministry, you have so many different regulatory departments that have control over different policy matters. So getting the state investment from one government department affiliated investor does not guarantee immunity from other government departments. Not to say, there's also central and local differences. Now, Weibo is one such example, right? I mean, it received the government's investment back in 2020. And last year, the firm continued to run into a lot of content moderation issues. It was fined 10 times last year. And in December last year, the Cyberspace Administration China even publicly announced reprimanded this firm, and that public announcement already sent the firm's stock tumbling for over 10%, right? So it definitely doesn't mean that they can address all of the regulatory problems.
What do you think is Beijing's long-term plan here? Is the worst of the regulatory storm since 2020 already over? Should investors remain cautious at this point?
I think the worst is over, at least for now. In the short term, it's quite clear from various policy signals and also from the regulations actions that you have seen in the past 6 months that this firm will get a reprieve, at least in the short term, as Beijing want to boost investor confidence and most importantly to live up this entrepreneurial spirit. So I think the next 6 months is a very good window. We expect things will be calm and will be relatively quiet from the regulation front as regulators return to their normal and routine enforcement. But you are right, for the longer term, things remain. The government wants to keep these tech companies on a very tight leash. And last week, China just promulgated an amendment of this antitrust law. And you see this revised draft is very similar to the previous draft that was released last year. And it comes with very high sanctioning power. And so clearly, antitrust, along with other regulations that were promulgated last year, particularly the data regulations, will remain a very strong and potent tools for the Chinese government to discipline the tech firms. Now, whether the government will really use these tools is another story, right? But the deterrence effects are already there.
Thanks for watching. You can find out more about China's business and economic landscape by subscribing to our newsletter, joining our premium Chinese business intelligence database, and of course, watching this show. Find out how to do all of that in the summary section of this video.